minutes because, you know, we're Jews. That at least the emails, I think, were a little misleading. The topic, at least the topic that I was given to teach about is the golden age of Jews in Spain, of which the Spanish Inquisition, I suppose, is sort of the epilogue, perhaps, the grim epilogue to the story. But the majority of our conversation actually will be about the couple of centuries of really a golden age for Jews in Spain and in the Iberian Peninsula. So more on that in a minute. Hi, everybody. Nice to see many familiar faces. Hi, Roy. How you doing?
Rabbi, doing well. You've been out on the lake.
Valerie. I have not. People keep asking me this. I have not played nearly as much golf as I should have been playing in all of this. I did sneak out the week before last, and it was not pretty. It was very pretty, actually. My golf game was not pretty, but good to be out there. I'll say, at least in my experience, and someone said this to me, that it's one of the few things that feels more or less normal in all of this, because once you're out on the golf course, it's, you know, you're out on the golf course. So, hi, Claudia. So nice to see you.
Hi. I know you always teach on days that I work, so I never get to see you.
Tuesdays, right? Well,
yeah, Tuesday I mostly work, so glad to see your face today.
I appreciate you making time.
Oh, I love all these classes.
Right? It's, you know, I think it's, I was actually talking to a soon-to-be new member of the temple yesterday afternoon, who's been temple shopping in the midst of a pandemic, which I think is an interesting experiment we were discussing, because ordinarily you go and you know, I don't know, show up on a Friday night and check out services and see, you know, which rabbi is the least boring. But so she's been temple shopping virtually, and it looks like we're winning, I guess, right, Jody? It's all competition. We're winning in terms of, I don't know, what we're doing and how engaged she thought it was.
But I remember
engaging.
temple shopping. I didn't do it virtually. I actually showed up. It was interesting. It was very interesting. You guys won, obviously, but
obviously. I think, you know, it's funny because the whole idea of temple shopping, I think, you know, it's the old joke about the Jew who's shipwrecked on the island, and they come to rescue him, and they find two synagogues, and they're like, what's going on? He said, well, this is the synagogue I built to go to, and this is the one I built that I would never go to, right? So, but the whole idea of the fact that we live in a time and geographically in a place in which the Jewish community is large enough, arguably, to support many, many different synagogues in multiple denominations. The fact that there are synagogues from which to choose and from which to shop is in and of itself, I think, something that is remarkable. I'm going to hazard a guess that those of us who did not grow up in Los Angeles, much less on the west side of Los Angeles, probably grew up in places where there was one synagogue. I grew up in, you know, the Jewish metropolis of Santa Barbara. There's one synagogue.
Wow.
And a Chabad. So take it or leave it, you know? So the idea that there's choice, and the fact that, you know, Wilshire is obviously the best, but the Wilshire can be the right fit for some folks, and other communities can be the right fit for other folks, I think is a pretty special thing that most of us probably take for granted and doesn't exist outside of, you know, LA.
I think sometimes people think it's too big.
Yep, absolutely.
And I once heard Rabbi Leader counter that argument when I first joined, and he said, it's especially big if you never show up.
Exactly.
And that resonated with me.
Is also what some people want. And I'm not here to judge that either. There are people that want to come 2 days a year and nobody bothers them. And that's totally fine too. You know, I'll quote, I've heard Rabbi Leader say that many times. I'll quote one of our past presidents, Barry Edwards, who was fond and still is fond of saying that big can be small, but small can't be big. And
that's, you know, so true, Rabbi.
Right, Miriam? What he meant by that was that, yeah, we're big. And yes, it's only really big if you don't show up, you know, but we can do things to make it feel like an incredibly small place, right? Lori, I'm going to put you on the spot and say, you're the first to tell us, right? It's 9, 10, regulars who are at our kitchen in Santa Monica every single Sunday making sandwiches for people, not the past few months, Lori's one of them. That's a very small community of folks right there. And you all deeply care about each other. That's a very small club, right? And we can, 150 family small congregation where everybody knows each other isn't building the Karsh Center, isn't putting content out every single day, 6 days a week, 5 days a week to keep us all connected and engaged, throughout this. So obviously I'm biased, but I think that, we have the ability to do things because of our size and because of our resources and because of we're able to have really talented people as a part of the family. So
Rabbi?
Yes,
Well,
Miriam.
I just want to say that I learned something from you already, even before the shiur started.
It always started. It started the minute we got here.
That's true. That's absolutely true. And that a big can always be small. Small will have tremendous difficulty trying to be big. Why is a big preferable? Because it's offering you smallies, a lot of little groups to join, a lot of little one-to-one groups if you want, which a very small synagogue very often cannot do. And the idea that we don't know everybody in the synagogue, I hope all synagogues will be able to reach that point. I hope all synagogues will have that many people that it's impossible to know them. And the idea is not to know everyone in the synagogue. The idea is to choose those classes that are meaningful. And those classes are small and interactive. And that's what everyone needs to do in their life, belong. I don't know, there are people who absolutely do not belong, and Judaism lets you feel a part of Judaism. And it's so important in growing up. And I give that advice only because I'm a little old myself, like 94. And so I say that the connectedness that a human being needs in order to grow healthy is one of the most important parts of their life. Sorry, absolutely. I didn't mean to preach.
Well, no, well said, Miriam. Well said. Yeah, look, without getting into a whole other topic about the state of modern American Judaism and synagogue life and the landscape of synagogues across the country, and I am by no means an expert, but I think that actually the two kind of poles of which we've been speaking, small synagogues and large synagogues, I think both have futures. I'm not so sure about those in the middle that are sort of big enough that they have a lot of overhead, but not so big that they can provide the resources that a place like ours can. I think that, and I don't think it's a good thing, but I think that the future for those size institutions is going to be challenging. In any case, as much as it's a topic that I love, the topic is not meant to be, modern Jewish institutions. Hi, Jan.
How are you?
I'm well, thanks. Nice to see you.
Yes, I didn't know if you remembered me.
Of course.
Oh, okay.
How's Rhonda doing?
Well, yesterday she gave birth to identical twin girls.
Oh my goodness. Please, please, please say Mazel Tov for me. And my God, that makes me feel old. Please say Mazel Tov for me. Everybody happy and healthy?
Thank God, yes.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's amazing. That's amazing, amazing, amazing. All right, we're gonna get to it. We're gonna get to it. So as I said at the beginning, we're talking about what's frequently known as the Golden Age in Spain, for Jews, particularly in Spain, and with a little bit of kind of a punctuation at the end, which is a bit of the Spanish Inquisition, which is in many ways sort of the end of the story. And I thought that, I've been thinking that it's maybe hopefully an interesting and hopeful topic to talk about today, because we're living in this time, I think, that is so deeply polarized, and I don't even necessarily just mean politically, but we sort of live in this time, I think for the last few decades at least, in which I think we spend a lot of time in at least in our civic lives and in our religious lives, focusing on differences less so than commonalities and similarities. right? I see this a lot in interfaith work, in which we spend all the time talking about the 2% of ideologies that are different and not the 98% of ideologies that are more or less the same. And so I think kind of in this time in which we find ourselves, I think there's something to be learned perhaps from this golden age in Spain, which is generally defined as beginning in the very beginning of the 8th century, 711-ish, and lasting kind of in earnest through the middle of the 12th century, 1147, 1150. And then again, kind of then deteriorating in many ways for another few hundred years until the Inquisition in 1492, right? Everybody thinks 1492 is famous because of Columbus, which I guess is true, but also for Jews anyway, because of the Inquisition. So we're gonna start, I'm gonna share my screen. I figured we should start. I'll let somebody in here. See if I can do this. Try to be very tech savvy here. We're gonna start hopefully with something that's a little bit familiar. Here we go. Can everybody see that? Yeah, nods. Great. Look familiar to anybody? Yeah, okay. So here's the question. Here's the question. First of all, I'll give you the softball question. Where have you seen this before? You can unmute yourself. We're all grown-ups.
Yeah, Wilshire Boulevard.
Yes, absolutely right. This is a pane from the murals, right? Anybody have any idea? You can hazard a guess. What is here? What we're depicting here? There's no penalty for a incorrect guess.
Well, the minarets would make us think of the Arabs, Muslims,
Very good.
or
Very good.
that would be their architecture. Minarets.
Absolutely, Miriam, you're right. Kind of this Moorish architecture that we know well.
Perhaps the one on the left might be a menorah on top of a dome, and the dome would be a very Jewish piece of architecture because they never wanted to do Gothic, which comes to a point, which is very Christian, and they would surely not do minarets, which were very Arab. So perhaps it's a Jewish building, one on the left.
Very good. Very good. Anybody else have anything to add?
They're Jewish stars, and could this be an Islamic crescent that is his necklace?
Absolutely. I think, Susan, I recognize your voice. Absolutely. Spot on. Okay, so this is from the murals. I'm going to read to you what Edgar Magnan said about this mural in 1930. So the title of this is The Muslim Period in Jewish History, which is in essence what we're talking about today, this golden age in Spain from the 8th century to the 12th century. And that the figure above represents the spirit of Judaism, adhering to the star and the crescent, the symbol of Islam. And these are actually all synagogues, Miriam, that are patterned after the mosques with their domes and their towers that dominate the foreground. And we're going to talk more about that later, this kind of collision of architecture. But I should have actually grabbed a picture of it, and maybe I'll look in a minute so I can quickly find it online. But some may have seen photographs of the previous home of Wilshire Boulevard Temple prior to 1929 at what's now 2nd and Broadway, the bottom of Bunker Hill, kind of near the Music Center. It's a parking lot for the LA Times, or what was the LA Times building now. But if you think of that architecture, it looks exactly like these, with these kind of minarets. There's Moorish, we call it, architecture that in many places, communities that could afford it, dominated much of certainly Reform synagogue architecture and to a lesser extent conservative synagogue architecture in the late 19th century, which really was and is, and again a little bit more on the architecture later, but borrowed from this kind of time period of Jews and Muslims living amongst each other. Okay, let's go here. This is another one. I'm guessing this one looks even more familiar to folks just because of where it's located in the mural in the sanctuary. Look familiar? right?
Yeah.
This is if you're sitting in your seats and you're staring at the bema, this is to your left, not quite under the American flag. Right? Okay. Any guesses what we have here?
I'm guessing, Rabbi, because I'm reading the Hebrew,
The
Refuah,
Hebrew, yeah.
Heshbon, and Philosophia.
Yes.
So that would
Oh, good for you.
translate, I think, as medicine, mathematics, and philosophy.
Bingo.
And
You know the
perhaps
funny thing
that
about
would-
this, when I pulled up this picture, I had forgotten that the Hebrew was there because of how it's placed in the sanctuary, and the Hebrew is relatively small, that unless you're looking for it, you don't see it.
Yeah.
Which I thought was just interesting when I was looking at this. So yes, right. So this is a mural that I'm going to go back to our friend Rabbi Magnin. So this is titled "The Contributions of Jews in the Middle Ages." Again, in this time period we're going to talk about today, and that these three figures who are depicted, the first one holding an empty slate, right on our left, typifying philosophy, and above him are, hopefully you can see, above him are scales, signifying truth and justice. The center figure in blue is holding an astrolabe, and above him is a sphere and an arc and a star, and he's symbolizing astronomy and astrology. And the figure in green on the right stands for medicine. Green apparently was the color worn by physicians in the Middle Ages. And the men on the left and the bottom who are looking up at these three figures are all there seeking knowledge. Okay. All there seeking knowledge. So I'm gonna,
There's a woman.
the woman in the middle, she's wearing gold.
No, I don't know.
Yeah, she's wearing a gold thing.
I don't think it's actually a woman.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Now she's got a little beard. She's got a little bit of a beard on her chin.
okay,
right.
nice. Youth.
So, right. So this golden age in Spain, that again is sort of exemplified or illustrated, I should say, in those paintings from our murals. It was this incredibly unique time really in earnest in the 10th and 11th centuries in Spain, in which Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived very closely together. And there was this cross-pollination, if you will, between them all, in which they were inspired by each other's intellectual works, creative works, religious works. And it was a time in Jewish history in which Judaism and Jewish life was open to new discoveries, including secular discoveries, secular learning in science, in philosophy, in medicine, in astronomy. And you had great Jewish thinkers, probably the most notable one being Maimonides, who absorbed and adapted these secular ideals and traditional Jewish learning and interpreted them and sort of brought them together in ways that infused each other, right? Maimonides famously, one of the most famous biblical commentators of all time, an incredibly learned rabbi, also a physician. And he used Jewish learning to influence his philosophy and medicine, and used his philosophical, secular, and scientific learnings to inform his Judaism as well. I think sometimes we think of, particularly in our contemporary narrative, not so much from a Jewish standpoint, but we think of science and religion as being opposites, as opposed to being complementary. And in this time period, they were very much understood, not just by Jews, by Muslims and by Christians as well, as being complementary in many ways. And what happens is, with the rise and expansion of Islam from about the 5th, 6th century forward, the Muslim empire starts to spread all over the Near and Middle East, through North Africa, and ultimately up into Spain. And these Arab conquerors, these Muslim conquerors, had a significant amount of tolerance for Judaism and for the Jewish people. It changed certainly from ruler to ruler, as these things often do. But in this period between the 8th century and the 12th century, generally speaking, not without exception, but generally speaking, Jews lived incredibly peacefully with their Muslim neighbors and were allowed to practice Judaism and exercise a tremendous amount of autonomy that we'll talk about in a few minutes over Jewish life and over their own communities. So I think this begs the question, how did this come to be? How did this seemingly almost pluralistic and tolerant time period come to be in Spain during this time? So in the year 711, I'm not big into dates, but I think it's helpful. So in the year 711, there's an Arab invasion from North Africa into the Iberian Peninsula, and that inaugurates this totally new era in Europe. And led by an Arab general named Tariq. So he moves from Morocco all the way up through the Iberian Peninsula. They overthrow the Visigoth, the Christian kingdom that's there. And this brings in what ends up being about 800 years of Muslim rule in Spain. And as a result, that whole area of the Iberian Peninsula comes to be called in Arabic Al-Andalus, or Andalusia, as many of us may know. And in Hebrew, Jews apply the Hebrew to it, Sfarad, which is where the idea of Sephardic Jews comes from. And we'll touch on that a little bit more in a few minutes as well. And this whole area then kind of exists, and this whole kind of milieu sort of exists and eventually starts to diminish after about the 12th century until finally, Granada falls in 1492, and our ancestors, along with many others, were expelled. In 1756, there's a coup in Damascus. The Umayyad dynasty in Damascus is overthrown. There's one surviving member who manages to escape and flees to Spain. I have to say that I think, just personally, there's an interesting kind of allegory, at least for me, to this story, because it almost reminds me of the story of Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, who is smuggled out of the old city of Jerusalem as the city's falling to the Romans in the first century in a casket, actually. He's the one surviving guy that makes it. He makes it to Yavna and more or less creates or begins to create Judaism as we know it today. I kind of think it's a similar story. The last surviving, member of this Umayyad dynasty who escapes in the middle of the coup, escapes to Spain, where in Cordoba, he establishes a new dynasty, a new house of Umayyads, and a new kingdom. And his goal is really to try to rival, what was there, the splendor that was there in Damascus, and to rival the Caliphate that at the time existed in Baghdad in terms of the opulence and the power. And over the next couple hundred years, he and his successors, they bring in hydraulic experts, they bring in artists, they bring in administrators, they repair all the old Roman trade routes and roads and aqueducts, they endow new libraries and mosques, and they want to really replicate this, what they see as this kind of lost glory that existed in the Arab world prior. And in trying to do that, they again bring in trendsetters, if you will, from the east, from Baghdad. They establish dazzling, beautiful courts, beautiful buildings. And in the early middle of the 10th century, they declare a caliphate in Cordoba, and that is important because it positions this whole area of Andalusia as being independent from the rest of the Arab world and from the rest of the Muslim world. And so it sets Andalusia on its own kind of independent, cultural in a way, but mainly political path, which I think sets the stage for so much of what ends up happening there, and so much of this kind of multicultural, pluralism, melting pot kind of vibe, for lack of a better way to say it. Right. So from that time, during this time, most of the Jews in Spain, they live under Muslim rule for about 400 years, from the 8th century to the 12th century. And in the 12th century, what happens is that the dynasty starts to begin to have some anti-Jewish legislation, and then ultimately you have Jews flee from Muslim Spain into Christian Spain, and they remain there for another century or two until 1492, when the whole thing kind of goes south. But over the centuries, what happens is because of the period of Muslim rule, because of the position of Christians and ultimately Christian rule in parts of Spain, Jews find themselves in a place that I think is historically anyway familiar, which is kind of being between these other peoples, kind of being in a way intermediaries between the Muslim community, Islamic community, and the Christian community, and often being, mediators, translators, and kind of moving back and forth between these different realms, as it were. And I think that these historical factors, these cultural factors, really made it possible and engendered Sephardic Jews as a unique branch of the Jewish people up until today. Unique in that it was a people who were multilingual, to people who were multi-talented, and also deeply attached to place, deeply attached to Andalusia, to the Iberian Peninsula, to Spain. And that these, I think, Sephardic Jews really soaked up and appreciated the cultural stimulation that living in this kind of civilization, Iberian civilization, that inspired so much craft and unique forms of expression, such as poetry. There's an explosion of medieval Hebrew poetry that comes out of this time, which notably poets like Saadia Gaon, Yehuda Halevi, both of whom ended up with poetry that you may not even realize because much of it finds its way into the prayer book. But they're products of this golden age. Again, these explorations of philosophy, of science, and the creation of monumental Jewish legal codes that to this day are still the sources of much of Jewish law and traditional Jewish practice. All of these things are products of this coexistence of these three cultures in this one, geographic kind of area or territory. And I mentioned this earlier, that within that, Jews enjoyed a tremendous amount of autonomy, almost like a state within a state, if you will. Wherever we settled, despite moving throughout some of these micro kind of kingdoms, wherever we settled, Jews continued to operate as this state within a state, exercising our own, taking care of our own financial, fiscal kind of economies and our own judicial system. And within this insular state within a state world, the center of that was, I don't think a surprise to anybody, it was the synagogue, right? Synagogue in the sense of being a communal gathering place. And there were hundreds of synagogues. We were just talking about the luxury of being able to synagogue shop. They could synagogue shop if they wanted. Hundreds of synagogues. There were big, grand, public synagogues, as it were, with incredible artisans and guilds that created them and built them. And there were private synagogues that were attached literally to the homes of wealthy families, which might sound bizarre, but those still exist today, right? There are still, believe it or not, private synagogues attached to people's homes, particularly in the Orthodox world today. And I mean, think about this. Here's a fun statistic, right? Cordoba and Granada each had about 5,000 or 6,000 Jews at the time, and had, at a minimum, we think, maybe 24 synagogues, right? And Toledo, which had not even 4,000 Jews, had 11 synagogues. Now, characteristically, as we saw in that mural, and as Miriam pointed out, these Iberian and to some extent the North African synagogues in Morocco and elsewhere, they shared a lot of the architectural and decorative features that we would think of as being part of a mosque. The construction was in a similar shape, usually in the shape of a rectangle. And unlike the way we think of most synagogues today, at least most Ashkenazi synagogues, in which, it's kind of almost laid out like a theater, and there's the bima and an ark usually on the east wall, unless you're at Wilshire Boulevard Temple. These were set up as rectangles, and the Ark and the Torah, instead of being on the eastern wall, were actually in the center of the room. Okay, in the center of the room, and there were, just like in a mosque, there were mats and cushions around it. And that's still the architecture in many synagogues. Many synagogues in Israel, you'll find the bima is basically in the middle of the room. If you go famously to Sephardic temple here, Sephardic Tifereth Israel on Wilshire Boulevard, just west of Sinai Temple, right? The bima is in the middle of the room. The ark's not, but the bima is in the middle of the room. So I'm going to share my screen again. We're going to look at a little bit of architecture. How do I do this? There we go. Okay. So let me do this the right way. Let's see here. Okay. Everybody see that? Oops. Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So this is a piece of a textile from from 14th century Spain. And it's an Islamic textile design. Okay. Now we can compare this to, we can compare this to this. I'm going to see if I can make it a little bit bigger.
Okay.
Okay, if you can make it out, there's actually Hebrew text here. Okay, right, and this, so that'd be easier. I'll just read it off my notes, so I'm not switching my screen back and forth. So this is something called micrography, which is a practice of creating designs instead of using lines, using tiny words, using text. And it was a practice that was shared by Muslims and Jews during this time period. And elaborate designs like this are found both in Hebrew religious texts and in Arabic religious texts from the time period, right? So not necessarily clear who borrowed the idea from whom, but I think it actually has certain artistic similarities to this kind of mosaic, which today I don't think any of us would necessarily associate with being certainly not exclusively Arabic, right? Okay, here's a good one. All right, so this, right? This was, when it was built anyway, the Grand Mosque in Cordoba. It now happens to be used, just as a fun fact, now happens to be used as a Catholic church. But in recent years, Spanish Muslims have lobbied the Roman Catholic Church for the right to come and pray here, to allow them to pray in this cathedral, okay? But wait for this. So this was the cathedral in Cordoba, right? This was the synagogue in Toledo. In some ways, I think it looks more like a mosque than the mosque, right? Particularly, it's not rugs, but actually when you look at the way the mosaic is on the floor, to me, it almost looks like it's set up for the way it would be for Muslim prayer. So this is the Synagogia Santa Maria la Blanca in Toledo, which sounds like a church, right? Other than the synagogue part, right? Santa Maria, right? La Blanca in Toledo, Spain, built in 1180. It's originally known as the Ibn Shushan Synagogue, and more commonly called the Congregational Synagogue of Toledo. It now happens to be a museum, also ironically owned and preserved by the Catholic Church. Right, but just to go back, this is the synagogue, that's the mosque. I mean, other than some color differentiation, it's identical, right? The architecture. And last, just because I think it's interesting, and I'll make this a little bit bigger. This is a, excuse me, it was in the Cordoba synagogue. Also, by the way, this synagogue here in Toledo is one of the oldest synagogues still standing in Europe from 1180. Just as a, so this is just a piece of the wall from the synagogue in Cordoba, a little bit newer synagogue built in 14th century, 1315, in the Jewish quarter in Cordoba. But here, even if you look at these walls and mosaics, there's I think very much of a kind of Arabian feel to it, right? When we compare this sort of mosaic to this tapestry, right, geometrically, I think it has a lot of similarity there. Okay, I'm gonna pop back over here. How's everybody doing? Everybody okay? Questions, comments? Like take a minute. I'm not like trying to get through all this. So I don't know. Reactions? Okay, we'll come back to it.
In a second, Eddie has a question.
Yeah, hey Eddie.
There was another major text besides the works by Maimonides by at that time.
We can't see Eddie's face.
Well,
I want to see your face.
He
I
likes
wanna
it that way.
Please sit so we can see you. We only see your pants and your shirt.
it's a
See, the
big
best
mistake.
part-
It's a big mistake, but let me accommodate you.
Yay, Eddie.
Okay. I can't see anything.
Yeah, that's an
The
improvement.
participants. Okay.
There was another major work by a guy north of, I want to say he was north of Spain, who wrote this long story in response to a king who said, why should I allow the Jews to live? Why shouldn't I be a Jew? Defend yourself. Either this is all bullshit and you should all leave, or else I should convert to Judaism. And he wrote it, and it's like one of the most important works from that period of time. Not an apologia, but maybe closer to, along the lines of the Greek treatment of the Jewish concept and the Jewish religion. Do you remember? You know what I'm talking about?
There's a few things that kind of fit that more or less story. I mean, that's right. That's also a common trope, right? That they, somebody on behalf of the Jewish people comes before the king and is told basically, can tell me why I shouldn't expel you, in essence, right? So there are a few historical kind of episodes that fit that. So I don't want to misspeak. I'm not exactly sure which.
I'll tell you.
Yeah, you can find Rabbi Google. I'm sure he has an answer.
Yeah, Rabbi Google.
He thinking of Khazaria, the Khazars?
It could be.
Khazaria.
Who?
Oh, Khazaria.
Yes.
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 It's the
Yes.
they were, they
Yeah.
did convert, the king converted, and the Khazars converted they were there for several, I think it was in the 800s, but I don't believe it wasn't in Spain. But the Khazars were
In Hungary.
Russia area.
In what's today Hungary. It's like 9th century in Hungary. Yeah.
What?
It's like 9th century Hungary.
Wait, I'm on the camera.
Yeah, so that's the 800s. Yeah, good.
Right. Okay, I'm gonna move a little bit forward, and then we'll come back to more thoughts and reflections in a few minutes. So this this coexistence, I don't mean to paint it like it was always, I don't know, rainbows and unicorns or whatever. You can tell I have a 4-year-old, right? That it was sometimes tenuous, this coexistence of these languages, of peoples, of religions, but that coexistence, although sometimes tenuous, also provided and produced an unbelievable kind of symbiotic civilization that was distinctive, and that was manifest in the art, in the architecture, in the music, in the science, in the poetry, in the literature. And this whole kind of, medieval pluralism, as it were, I think is particularly well suited to lay the foundation for this explosion of expression for Judaism and in Jewish culture and in Jewish philosophy and in Jewish art, and all of it. So, I mean, this was one of, until what we call the Haskalah, a few hundred years later, one of the greatest explosions of kind of Jewish creativity, in much of Jewish history. You have Jewish physicians and mathematicians and astronomers who contribute to the growth of science. You have Jewish merchants who set up new trade routes, through the Middle East. Jews work as farmers, as winemakers, as goldsmiths, as tailors, and merchants and traders. And it's a tremendous period of prosperity for Jews who are successful and really, really, really prosper. The Spanish Jews had opportunities in fields and to study things that had been inaccessible for most of Jewish history. They became doctors, they became scientists, and they advanced these fields with all of the new knowledge that they acquired. They traveled widely, became very well educated, and in some cases had access to government positions even. As a part of all this, there's new schools of learning that are established. I spoke about poetry, but incredible poets, writers, thinkers, particularly in Cordoba, develop, creative work. You have scholars actually from Babylonia who come to Cordoba, bring the Talmud, Babylonian Talmud, with them to Cordoba, and again, as is a theme, these ideas sort of get woven together, right? And you have kind of these rabbinic Talmudic pieces of knowledge that permeate other aspects of what we would consider more secular learning, and vice versa. You have some of the philosophical and scientific aspects of the kind of academy, to put it in more Aristotelian terms, that make it into rabbinic texts and rabbinic literature as well. The poetic expression, as I said, I mentioned Tzadia Gaon and Yehuda Halevi earlier, but Yehuda Halevi particularly masters Hebrew, Arabic, and the Talmud, and physical sciences, and he kind of is in one person the vessel for sort of all these things, which all come out in his poetry, kind of this amalgamation of all these concepts and ideals. Tzadia Gaon, who I mentioned, accomplished poet as well, but probably known most, I'm surprised, Jessica told me she didn't, Leah Hochman, who taught last week, for those who were here, Tzadia Gaon is like one of her favorite Jewish thinkers to have ever lived, and she usually finds a way to talk about Tzadia Gaon regardless of what she's teaching. So I'm surprised it didn't come up. But Tzadia Gaon, among other things, potentially most famous for the fact that during this time period, he compiles one of the very first ever prayer books, which he calls, big reveal, the Siddur. Right? Siddur comes from the same root as Seder, right? Which means order. It was literally like the order of the prayer service. And this is a big deal, actually, because the synagogue prayer service had no fixed order or content, really, up until this point, the 9th, 10th century, right? So this idea of like Jewish prayer looking the way it does more or less today is only about 1,200 years old. So he creates this prayer book and kind of fixes that order. And I think, this in the arc of history, this kind of brief period of time, but it was I think in many ways remarkable, run of a couple hundred years that just infused and was almost maybe the good way to say it is like rocket fuel, I think, actually, for Jewish culture and for Jewish expression. And again, I mean, one of my lasting takeaways from this is this idea that here was a period of time in which science and traditional secular learning and Jewish learning or other religious learning of Islam and Christianity were not incompatible with one another, but actually nurtured one another, and that studying both disciplines or multiple disciplines and bringing those together was actually the mark of a true wise person, a true intellect, right? I mean, again, think about Maimonides, right? Maimonides takes all of Aristotelian thought and he applies it to rabbinic Judaism. And as a result comes up with this, Mishnah Torah, this monumental code of Jewish law that, to this day is one of the seminal works of Jewish law. So what ends up happening in the 11th century, as the story kind of starts to wind down, is this caliphate that was established in Cordoba kind of falls apart. And Andalusia gets divided into like 20 or 30 different kind of little statelets or little like micro mini kingdoms. And each of them has its own court and has its own poets and scientists and its own kind of, patronage, medieval patron system kind of situation. And Jews continue to flourish in all these little places and spread out in all these little places. And what ultimately happens is with this kind of anti-Jewish and to a certain extent anti-Muslim legislation that comes about in the 13th century. Jews flee to what was Christian Spain, and this sort of slow demise begins. And as most of us are familiar, in 1492, March to be precise, King Ferdinand and Isabella decree that all the Jews of Spain have to be either convert or forced into exile and Muslims. Yeah. Yep. Yes. Well, a few years later, not in 1492. 1492, it's the Jews, I think in like August, which I only remember because my birthday's in August, are forced to either convert to Christianity and expelled. And the Muslims, same, a couple of years later. The Muslims actually weren't expelled from Spain until I think the 17th century. And I think that, this was a big deal for Jews. I remember once upon a time, I think my grandfather telling me that, someone told him that our family, the Shapiros, at some point had been in Spain and expelled in 1492. I have absolutely no evidence that that's the case, but have used it on occasion to eat rice on Pesach. I think that, so from generations, I think, and this is going to be in a visual in a second, we're going to kind of begin to conclude, it looms large for Jews, definitely, I think. And it was a tragic fate, and it brought, a very sharp end to one of the most beautiful periods in Jewish history. But the legacy of this period is alive and well, I think, even to this day, right? The legacy of this medieval pluralism and the architecture and the language of Ladino, right? Which, for those who don't know, is kind of the analogous to Yiddish. Ladino was this uniquely Sephardic language, which, as Yiddish is a combination of German and Hebrew, Sephardic is a combination of Spanish and Hebrew. Which is still spoken by some today. And look, obviously the legacies of Maimonides, of Ibn Ezra, of Yehuda Halevi, of Sadega, on all of them. I mean, the list could go on and on and on. Is part of mainstream Jewish culture today. So the last thing I'm going to show you to kind of end where we began, and then we can discuss a little bit. We're going to go back to, see if this works. Okay, everybody see that? Okay, we're going to go back to the sanctuary. We're going to come back to the sanctuary. Not sure if anybody recognizes this. This is also, we're basically moving from where those philosophers are, if you're sitting in the room, right around to the end of the mural, to Bema right, congregation left, right under the American flag. And we'll go back. Well, actually, I'll go back to you guys. So what do we see here?
Looks like a fire-breathing dragon, kind of.
Yeah. Okay.
And a warrior.
Right. And there's like some kind of guy soldier with like a spear. Right.
Attacking this church or synagogue here. And there's 4 people below it trying to flee, and houses are on fire.
Needless to say, right, the sky is kind of dark. I mean, it does not look like a happy scene, right? So this, I'm going to go back to, just because it's fun to.
There's a bat there. There's a bat also in the background.
A bat?
Look under the guy's red cape.
Oh yeah, you're right. You're right.
Batman.
Oh yeah.
You're right. So I'm going to go back to Rabbi Magnin. So this is entitled Inquisition.
Yeah.
This painting is entitled Inquisition. A cathedral tower and a portal, the figure of terror in the sky riding upon a gruesome beast which breathes fire. He's pointing his destructive lance toward the Jews who are being driven out of the town and crossing a bridge on their journey over the world. And the houses are burning. Right. So not, solely, right, necessarily the Spanish Inquisition, because our people were driven from all sorts of places, time and time again, which we'll get to a little bit in the next piece, right? And then this is followed by the beginning of the last pane of the mural, which I think most of us are familiar with, which is this, right? Which can I make this? I don't know if I can make this bigger. Okay, so this, right, called the Processional, which I think makes sense, is Jews in Spain removing Torah scrolls from the ark, getting ready for their journey out of the country. And the light shines through the synagogue windows behind them. And the everlasting lamp, the eternal light hangs there, right, over the ark. And this picture is meant to typify, yes, the exile of Jews from country to country throughout Jewish history, and particularly the exodus of Jews from the exile of Jews from Spain in 1492. And this beautiful piece that, if anybody remembers, hopefully not, I quoted actually on Rosh Hashanah during our service this year in referencing this panel in the mural, actually before the Torah service. But this is also Rabbi Magnin, that wherever Jews wandered, they carried their Torah with them in their arms and in their hearts. And you have here on the right side of the pane, a figure of youth with his arm outstretched, after his hand holding a wand from which light radiates. And that is meant to typify hope for the future. Right? The idea is that light is hope for the future. And I think that, I'm going to stop this. I think that from my perspective, that's maybe the lasting, maybe not the lasting legacy, but the forward-thinking lesson, perhaps, of this golden age of Jewish life and Muslim life and Christianity that existed in Spain for the better part of 500 years, 400 or 500 years, which is that it's possible that kind of tolerance, that kind of collaboration and sharing of ideas and traditions and cultures and language and food and architecture and art and poetry and literature is clearly possible because we've done it. And would that we do it again someday, and that we have another golden age for again, not just Judaism, but for religious society. So
Amen.
That's what I got. Amen, right? That's what I got. I'm going to look in the chat here. I think, no, those are all from Jessica. So happy to, we got 5-10 minutes left. Happy to discuss thoughts, reactions.
I've got it.
Yeah,
I
Valerie.
learned this kind of ties in with the talk, the webinar the temple had on Monday with that tour guide who talked about the Jews in Poland. And I asked,
and he's doing one on Spain, I think, in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, and I asked because I couldn't figure out how the Ashkenazi Jews got to Eastern Europe, and he said a lot of it probably from the expulsion from Spain. Yeah. So I never tied that together.
Absolutely.
How did they go from the Middle East to Eastern Europe?
Right. I love that. Interestingly, also, I mean, it was already happening before the expulsion because Spain was sort of this epicenter of philosophy, of literature, of poetry, of art. And so what you had frequently is you had Jews taking these philosophical works, poetic works and whatnot from Spain, taking them with them to France, to wherever, and translating them into whatever the, pardon the pun, lingua franca would be, wherever it was that they were living in, right? By the way, Rashi, perhaps one of the greatest biblical commentator of all time, wasn't in Spain, but was in France during this time period, right? So yeah, you have I think Spain sort of serves as this epicenter, and ultimately with the Inquisition and people really leaving, but because of trade, because of all sorts of things,
and huge amounts went to Amsterdam.
Right.
I was just going to say that because Valerie made me think of all the Sephardim that went to Holland.
Yeah.
And they started the Spanish. Yeah.
The Spanish Portuguese Synagogue, which is still standing.
How did they get there? That was so far away. I mean, did they trek there on foot?
They took an Uber. The Spanish Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam is, I believe, I don't know if I'm not mistaken, certainly when it was built, but I think to this day is the largest synagogue in terms of seating capacity in all of
Very
Europe.
huge.
Where?
It's huge. Yeah, Eddie.
Amsterdam.
Amsterdam.
Oh, and then they started the stock market there, didn't they?
This is what I
I'm not
know
sure
about the two points, Valerie's and yours. For the Dutch at that time were starting to become a trading nation, and the Jews
Yes.
had an enormous network.
Yeah.
And the Dutch knew what was happening in Spain and said, let's take them. We'll enrich our country. And that was what, because they gave them, they didn't burn them, they didn't kill them, there were no pogroms. So they had safety in the Netherlands, in the Low Countries.
Mhm.
The migration to Eastern Europe and Russia took place not at this point, but 200 years later after the expulsion from England. And those people went directly to Eastern Europe when they were expelled from England.
I always wondered if the Dutch East India Trading Company was somehow connected with the Jews.
It had to have been.
I don't believe so. I do know that, which others may know as well, that the Pilgrims spent time in the Netherlands with Jews immediately prior to voyaging here, which is why it's not by accident that Thanksgiving, they most likely celebrated Sukkot with the Jews in the Netherlands and then came here, and Thanksgiving was absolutely, I think, modeled in a way, or I shouldn't say modeled, that Sukkot was likely their frame of reference in creating Thanksgiving.
There was answering Muriel's, the Dutch West Indies Company did have Jews on the board from what I had read. And I remember when Peter Stuyvesant didn't want Jews in New Amsterdam, and they said, no, if I remember correctly, no, this can't be. So they, and just knowing some of Dutch history, there were Jews involved with the West Indies.
There was another route for Jews to get into the Eastern European segment. When the Jews left Spain, they went to Morocco. From Morocco, they went back to Egypt. From Egypt, they went back to Israel. And then when they left Israel, they went into Anatolia, which is really Turkey, which had really adopted Judaism as a national religion vis-a-vis the king at that time. And ultimately, when things changed in Anatolia, they migrated into Lower Russia and then into East Germany.
We're talking about Maimonides, who was obviously a product of this, but actually, just in full disclosure, did not write the Mishnah Torah in Spain. He did it in Egypt because he
wrote it in Egypt.
Yes.
Did you say? I didn't know that.
Yeah, he wrote it in Egypt.
But speaking of Maimonides, so I don't know. I'm sorry if you've already mentioned it. It was. But my question was, my point was that yes, the Mishnah Torah was critical for Jews, but it was the guide for the perplexed. That was really the second reform movement of Judaism. The first being, Yehuda, Joachim. If Jerusalem was the first reform, Guide for the Perplexed was the first effort at trying to give a modern rationalist approach to, hey, Judaism, it's not magic. It's not mysticism. We don't have cults. This all makes sense.
Right.
But here's the point. At the end of the book, what does he say? You can't be a Jew unless you believe Torah. Moses got the Torah on the top of Mount Sinai. So forget everything I just said. That's how the book ends.
And by the way, as Jessica just pointed out to me in the chat, the Rambam Maimonides was like I don't know about the chief, but was an incredibly prominent position in Egypt at the time that he's writing on this. Lori, I see your hand up.
What are the chances that Columbus actually was a Marrano?
Oh, I don't know. I'm sure there's some conspiracy theory. I'm sure there's some conspiracy theory about it.
Wishful thinking. Columbus was Italian, so probably not much of a chance.
That's true. That's true.
I think I saw another hand. Maybe not. No. All right.
But it's amazing when you comment about the quality and the discoveries and the knowledge expansion during this time. And it really reflects one of the only times in history where the two greatest religions of the world, Judaism and Islam, and the influences from Iran and Iraq and the intelligentsia actually were united in their approaches, not only in science, but in religion and in theology of all sorts, to create a golden age.
And 100%. And I think that, you know, let's say this, it's of note, I guess, that such a thing
could happen.
So foreign and impossible, potentially, you know, in a widespread way, at least today. Mark, good to see you, man.
Good to see you.
I like the beard.
Well, I have military next weekend, so enjoy it while you can, because it's got to go soon. So two things. One, so it was three religions, right? I mean, it wasn't just Muslim and Jew, right?
Yeah,
and there were universities that people were sent to. I mean, the Christian noble people sent their children to those universities, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. And then the timing. So Ferdinand and Isabella are conquering or finishing the conquest in Granada, right? In 1492. And Columbus is heading into France at that point when they call him back. I think he had petitioned them and they were too busy with their war. They finished the war, they issue that proclamation against the Jews, right? And then they call Columbus back. Like he was about to cross into France or something when they call him back and send him out to the New World. I'm trying to remember, when I was in Granada, I thought that was the 1, 2, and 3 steps.
That sounds right to me. I'll be the first to say it's been a while since I studied that side of the story. So I don't want to misspeak, but that sounds right to me. Somebody else may know.
All right, we'll call it the truth.
Yeah. All right.
Just one quick
Marian.
question. Yes. Now there was such beautiful coexistence at that time between Muslims, the Moorish, and their culture, and Jews and Judaism. There seemed to be mutual tolerance, etc. A quick question. 1, where were the Christians at that time? And 2, who was ruling that allowed, who was the wonderful leader who was ruling that permitted and encouraged such sharing of culture?
Right.
Instead of enmity, which we're having a lot of right now before the election, truly we're having hatred in this country. So who was it? Which leader was able?
So this was a great question. So the Christians were there, a minority, just like Jews. The other piece of this, right, is that Jews, it was such a multicultural place at the time. Jews were one of many different minority groups, not the single minority group, which I think also kind of adds to a comfort, actually. But in terms of leadership, this was under Muslim rule. This was under the rule of the Umayyad, really, the remnants of the Umayyad dynasty. And in terms of rulers, it was, over the course of a few centuries, a few of them. And not to say that the tide didn't change a bit, potentially from ruler to ruler, but this was, under Muslim rule, which I think, again, to what I was saying earlier, I think sadly seems, unimaginable potentially today.
But wasn't a lot of it the Catholic Church that really came down the heaviest, both against the Muslims and against the Jews? The Catholic Church?
Later, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think it's an accident that both that mosque and the synagogue, of which I showed you pictures, are now owned by the Catholic Church.
There were Iraqi Jews.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, there's actually Iraqi Jews. There's an Iraqi Jewish community in Jerusalem now. They have a great restaurant, like a block off
And the king of Morocco was, the Jews did fairly well in Morocco.
For a period of time, yeah. Susan?
Yeah, just to respond to some of Miriam's question, a lot depend from what I have learned on which rulers. The Mayas were good in Cordoba, but there were other caliphates as well. This wasn't international caliphate.
Right.
And when
Right, which is why the fact that it's like the beginning of the 10th century, the fact that they established a caliphate in Andalusia on the Iberian Peninsula, and that creating a certain amount of autonomy and independence from the rest of the Muslim world, I think actually is what enabled this to happen.
Right, and then the Almohads came, and
yes.
It was terrible for Jews, and that's when Rambam, Maimonides, and his family had to flee. So it wasn't.
They go to Egypt. A lot of other Jews go to Christian Spain.
Yeah, and then also to disabuse that everything was. I mean, it was. I like this golden age of Spain, but the Jews and the Christians were considered dhimmis. So they were of lower status than the Muslims. They had to wear hats. They had to step aside when on the street when a Muslim was there. The synagogues couldn't be built tall because they didn't want to overpower some of the mosques, and there were social rules like that. So. Some of it depended how stringently they were carried out by which caliphate was ruling then, but it wasn't necessarily universal that all of this goodness was, and that there were certain things that Jews had to obey.
One of the other elements of the question about where was Christianity, remember this flourished only because the Christian church was involved with the Holy Wars and taking over or attempting to conquer the Holy Land, quotes. And that took 200 years to be overrun by the Muslim populations. And then the Muslim population expanded into the continent because they were basically moving in a vacuum because Christianity was weakened by the years upon years of wars that the Holy Land took up for them in their crusades. So there was an opportunity for them to expand their influence and grow.
Yeah, I mean, the crusades really in earnest start as this is starting to wind down for the most part. But fair to say that it happened because they weren't in power, potentially, right? That they were a minority, at least at the time. Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate you spending a little bit of time with me today. I'm up again tomorrow. If anybody's around at noon tomorrow, we're going to talk about we're going to look at a series of texts that speak to kind of the role and our responsibility to our natural environment, to the planet, and
texts
kind of
from the Bible, from the Tanakh. Texts from the Talmud, texts from the Talmud or the Tanakh?
Both.
Both, okay.
Both.
So I'm going to have a Tanakh open.
Okay. I'll have the text. I'll share them on the screen. But so that's tomorrow at noon if you're so inclined and around. But thank you all. And
thank you.
Have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great.
Great.
Claudia. Oh, she left.
You're welcome, Michelle.
It was wonderful, Rabbi.
Thank you, Miriam.
And I'm going to see you at noon.
It's good to see you, Beau. Thank you.
Good to see you too.
Thank you, Beau.
You're very welcome, Jen. Mazel tov, mazel tov.
Thank you.